are. Hi, Kara. Welcome.
Thank you for talking with me.
Kara, how did we meet? You want to go back 5 years and tell a little bit of our story?
Um, yeah, it does seem like a long time ago, and then maybe not so long ago. Um, in 2015, February 2015, I started with World Relief, an international development organization that specifically resettles refugees and supports refugees and immigrants, but does resettlement. And so they're one of the few organizations that have a contract with the federal government to do that resettlement. So they hired me to open an office in Akron, Ohio. And I started out, it was me and my laptop, and South Street Ministries graciously gave me free space
That
and
little office space.
a little office in a neighborhood that we didn't put a sign out front because we weren't sure we really wanted everyone to know we were there. Um, and we, part of what World Relief does is work with churches, specifically evangelical churches. And so Christ Community Chapel was one of the churches that was open to supporting World Relief when they opened the office. And so I think you and Bina came to that little office on Grant Street, down in South Akron.
I still remember that first meeting with you and Rachel, I think it was. And I don't even think Christian was there. And I actually hadn't fully moved back to Ohio yet. So I had done a year in Florida, was intending to move back overseas. I had lived in the UK for 11 years. And so basically, I brought my stuff to Ohio, had that meeting with you guys because we were like, okay, we need to start partnerships. Like, we don't know refugees. And then I moved back to the UK for a month. I had to sell my car and figure out what to do with all my stuff that had been in friends' houses in storage for 10 months. So yeah, that was a really memorable meeting. And I think for me, I'm just really grateful for you and the girls that you're working with. I mean, you guys were about 4 months ahead of my learning, but so much of what I learned in terms of how to posture ourselves towards refugees and then what we ended up developing through what we called crossings at our church just had to do with these really healthy, good like ways of perceiving, how do you welcome folks who are coming with trauma? What do reciprocal relationships look like? How do you practice good cross-cultural skills and care well for people and show them the love of God when they've been through so much? So thank you for my education from you guys.
Thanks for being part of the early days and that we're still friends.
Oh, I'm so grateful. We're still friends and we now mirror each other's dressing habits. That's a little weird. I'm a little distracted by that. I don't know if anyone else is watching this. All right. So Kara, you led the office for 5 years. Obviously, I mean, I know some of your stories, but everyone else doesn't. Let's just tell some stories. Like, how have immigrants impacted your life and transformed your life? Like, what are some of those notable friendships, relationships that shaped you?
I guess I would say, part of the reason that I was attracted to the role is because I had spent 3 years living in England and then 4.5 years after that doing international anti-human trafficking work. So I did a lot of work in Ghana, West Africa, and Thailand. And then the more I was working in aftercare, the more I cared about prevention. So started a project up in Cambodia. And I experienced so much grace and so many people who stepped into moments in my traveling or my learning overseas, or even some really, really challenging situations overseas. And to experience that grace or that welcoming or that help, when the opportunity to start World Relief in Akron, my birth town, came up, the first thought I had was, can I return the welcome to people who are coming to my own birth city? And I think, you learn a lot living overseas and working overseas, and you realize that you'll never know a different culture quite the same as you do your birth town culture. And so what does
So true.
it look
So
like?
true.
What does it look like to kind of combine those things? And so, yeah, I mean, probably the most compelling story, and I've shared it a couple times, and the very first couple that arrived through our office, we had a lot of learning still to do. And it's, I had not yet hired the caseworker or the volunteer coordinator when we were told that our first family was coming. So they both had said yes to job offers, but they hadn't started yet. And so we were given a week and a half to prepare for this family. And prepare meant to find housing for them, to find furniture to put in that housing, like really basic furniture so that they could start the foundation of their new life. We had never done this before, and actually the caseworkers went down to the Columbus office, and the caseworker there who was supposed to train them got really sick, and they were there for an hour and turned around and came back to Akron.
I don't think I knew that part. I mean, I knew it was a crunch of time. I didn't
Yeah,
know their training had even been cut off.
they
Wow.
were literally like, she got sick at the Social Security office in Columbus and sent them home. Um, so we hadn't really had a whole lot of training. And so in the lead up of that week and a half to find housing, we struggled. We talked to a lot of different people. We ended up getting a call. We tried originally and to look at the little small apartment complex where his family lived, but there wasn't anything open. So we were talking with other people. We ended up getting a call back from that apartment complex and said that they ended up having to evict a family because of a long history, and they just happened to make the decision that week. So, and that meant an apartment was coming open right next to his family. And then we were able to work with the Furniture Bank in Cuyahoga Falls. And they were so gracious. And Craig, the man who runs that furniture bank, actually offered the furniture to us from the furniture bank and brought it to their apartment with his own truck.
Gosh.
So just a lot of grace in the preparation. And then when that couple arrived, the caseworker was sitting with them at the Social Security office, because that's you do that within the first 3 to 5 days of a family arriving, is get their Social Security number to align so that they can start working. So they were sitting in the Social Security office, and the woman, our caseworker, was talking with them, and a couple, just a man and woman in their 40s, no children. He started asking her, "What does your dad do?" And the caseworker just responded saying that he taught people about Jesus. And so then they responded and said, "What? You know Jesus? Like, do you love Jesus? We love Jesus. And we've been praying every day for the past 8 years to come to America." And they had specifically been praying for where they would live, what would be in their home, and who their caseworker would be. And
I
based
know
on,
this story and it still gets me every time.
yeah, I think about that. I think about that story a lot, in the sense of, especially we, and I say, we could encapsulate certain people, but I think we as majority culture, where we don't have to navigate as white people with a Christian background, we don't have to navigate a lot of minority nuances in the way that we think. And so often we come into situations thinking everyone thinks like us. And it's really, I think I've had enough experiences leading up to this that this was no longer my thinking. But I think it's such a beautiful story, because often white Americans think that they're bringing God to other places, or that they're the ones tasked with sharing the message or the gospel of Jesus with foreigners or people who don't look like us. And we often assume they don't know. But it was really the opening of that office, the team that was chosen, the fact that they were the very first family to come through the office, and the fact that their prayers paved the way for our learning for how to resettle families. And then their faithfulness in prayer is not something that I think I've ever heard someone in America talk about, praying for something every day for 8 years. And then to be able to be on the receiving end of that story, to know that you are part of God's working through them, it's just very humbling, and just a lot of grace. And I think God's grace in God knowing the timing of opening the World Relief Office and the challenges that we would face, and the ultimate closure, that to start it through a refugee couple's prayers always leads me back to God's faithfulness.
That's such a good word. It's interesting you brought up the perspective of American Christians versus what we don't realize we're receiving when we receive refugees. And I think you're right. A lot of people think we're receiving people in need and we have to be the helpers, or we're going to be the ones who bring the gospel. And I think one of the things that struck me is how, there's such a concern across the church, like particularly if you look at church numbers, baptisms in places like the Southern Baptists, that numbers are dwindling. Like people are leaving the church in pretty large numbers, especially millennials and younger. I know the Southern Baptist did a study, and like a couple years ago, they were down like 300,000 baptisms and things like that. And so we definitely see our country moving towards secularism. And yet when I meet a lot of immigrants, I'm meeting people who are coming and they are faithful followers of Jesus, and they're planting churches here, and their prayer lives are so overwhelming. Like I remember two of the folks that I became friends with, and I'm still friends with them. I spoke to one of them this week. They were two guys, both from the same culture, so from Nepal, 19 and 24 at the time, 5 years ago. And one of them was still in high school, and they had planted a church together. And I was like, what? Like, that's not what the average 19-year-old American is doing. And so they wanted like a space to host a conference for Nepalis, a Bible conference. And it was what they called their youth, which includes like from like our high school age up to like unmarried 20 somethings. And so I arranged for them to use space at my church, and it turned out 300 Nepalis showed up, and they had driven from Minnesota, from upstate New York, from Eastern Pennsylvania, and they ran and organized their entire conference. They had curriculum and speakers and brought in all of these pastors who were doing Bible training for them. And it was 300 young people who did not grow up in Christian backgrounds, who were just sharing Jesus and planting their own churches. And that was like, okay, the American church thinks we're dwindling. Maybe we should pay attention to what God's doing as immigrants. Really often they've walked through so much persecution. That people group had spent 20 years in a refugee camp. Most of those younger people were born there. It was so shaping for me at that perspective change. And I've kind of felt that as I've met even undocumented immigrants from places like Central America who didn't come through refugee resettlement. They came asking for asylum, and some of them were pending asylum cases. Some of them were still in hiding because they were fearful of, our harsh immigration policies at the moment that are just deporting everyone and not really giving them a fair asylum trial. But many of them were followers of Jesus who actively had these amazing prayer lives and, lived out their faith really publicly in ways that I have a lot to learn from. Wow. Yeah, that's impactful. Is there any other things that kind of stood out to you story-wise?
I think there's a hospitality, and I would say it hasn't mattered which culture. So I think through World Relief Akron, we predominantly resettled people who were coming through Nepal, and Southeast Asia, so Myanmar, people who are coming from Myanmar, people coming from Iraq or Afghanistan, specifically men and their families who had served with the U.S. military. And whether a family was from Southeast Asia or from Congo in Africa or from the Middle East, the level of hospitality is it's almost shocking. Like for me, almost shocking. And I have lived in the South in America and grew up half of my life in Atlanta, Georgia, and spent about 5 years in Texas. And so the South has a hospitality and a reputation for hospitality that we in the Midwest don't have.
I don't know any of my neighbors. It's so sad.
Yeah, it's less normal. I think it maybe has something to do with the cold weather, but it didn't matter where someone came from. The welcome that we received in supporting refugee families, the welcome that we received was always just really beautiful. And to have helped a family resettle in America, and as a caseworker or as the director, and then volunteers I know experience this as well. It's just so thinking of moments of the amount of food that I was given, or just how kind and generous people were. And I think someone said at one point that when you welcome a guest into your home in Nepal, you treat them as if they were God.
Wow. Wow.
Just the attitude
Yeah.
toward welcoming
Unbelievable.
is just something really beautiful. And I think the value for family, I'm divorced, and often families would ask me, they often, because of their own value for family, ask like, where is my husband, or do I have children? And so when I would share, people would often be surprised. I think in America it's so normal, so we don't really respond with surprise. But there would be a surprise. And I remember someone saying to me, "Oh, when we marry forever." And just the value for family and the value for children and the value of their elders and seniors, it's not normal whatsoever for them to send their elderly parents somewhere else to live. The expectation is that they stay with the family and they're cared for. And so I think just that's more general, but I think those experiences have shaped me, have shaped my perception of people who are coming from other places.
Yeah, it does allow you to evaluate your own culture, because while you said at the beginning, we know our own culture the best, I also think there's a blindness to our own culture. While you know it the best, you live it out the best. I think of that little parable about the fishies in the water, where a couple fishies are swimming around, and then the older fish goes by the younger fish and says, "Hey, nice water." And the younger fish says, "What's water?" I think culture is this ability that you don't see your own water. You can't see your own culture until you have someone else living so differently that it jars you a bit. And then you're like, sometimes you're like, "Oh, I prefer my culture." But other times you're like, "Ooh, we got some work to do." Like maybe there's some things that I really want to adopt that. So I know, like, being around Afghans from both the Hazara and the Pashtun people group, I mean, yeah, how they treat strangers is unreal and has really set a pattern for how I want to do hospitality. Syrians too. Actually, I'd say most Muslim people groups, they bend over backwards with care for and attention to and making sure you're going to gain 20 pounds. But it's a real sense of honor that they love to bestow on their guests, which is beautiful.
I think one other thing I'd just say in that same train of thought, that I actually had, refugee families were were often very surprised to see homeless people, and to see, yeah, so if you see someone on the corner holding a sign, always would get asked a question about that because they couldn't believe in America that that would happen. And I actually had a group of Nepali Christians come and approach me at World Relief to ask how they could help the homeless people. And so they actually wanted to do like a drive and gather clothes and food and things like that and take it around, which they did.
Wow.
So I don't think we hear those kinds of stories, but it's interesting how for so many of us, not all, not everyone, and I would say in America we sometimes have more safety nets for people in poverty, but for them to witness that and the response to be, how do we talk with them? What do they need? What can we give them? Was also, yeah, there's a compassion and an empathy that's born out of their own suffering.
Yeah, it's really beautiful. They are not the people who passed by the person suffering. They are like the Good Samaritan who stops, sometimes at great cost to themselves, which is really incredible. So, okay, this is a harder question. Like, both of us, ended up mobilizing and training. I started with my church and then I moved on to, I was like fake World Relief staff. That's how I always explained it. In fact, it's your fault that I have my current job because you would delegate things to me that World Relief ran out of staff for. But we worked with a lot of churches. I mean, you worked with more than I did, but I probably worked with a dozen in the area. And we also saw World Relief close. So I still remember the last day of the office being there with, Stephen and James and, these pastors and us just crying and praying together in that office. How has the response of the church, both positive and negative, affected your faith towards the response towards refugees and the response towards, some of these national policies that have basically shut down refugee resettlement?
Yeah, that's a big question. It's been just over a year, and the job that I am in now, I started on June 1st this year, which was exactly 1 year to the day that World Relief closed. And I have mourned it pretty deeply, and I think still occasionally do. I think there are a couple of things I guess I would can think of. Something that I think I witnessed over and over, I did a lot of public speaking, and I was invited by a lot of churches to come and speak about refugees, especially because it was such a significant topic. And I remember one specific moment speaking to a church in Akron, and I was standing at the podium, and as I was speaking, you look out and you can see the audience, and you can see the people with their arms crossed sitting back who are very skeptical, and you can see the people who have more of a warmth, and you notice that. And I think I tended to do it, depending on the size of the group, do some Q&A at the end. And at this church, when I opened it up for Q&A, there was a woman there who was sitting in the row of chairs, front row, and she was sharing more than she was asking. And she was sharing about, there are these people who live down the street in this house, and they're involved with drugs and trafficking, and we think they're molesting children, and like, why are they here? And so, a lot, like repeating a lot of the narrative, I think, that's been in the media since 2017. And sitting right in the row behind her, one seat over, was a friend who came as an immigrant to the US from Peru. And as this woman in the front row was talking, and this woman from Peru sitting right behind her was sitting there with tears just rolling down her face. And to witness moments like that, where someone in the church was talking about people as though they were other and so far away, and some other group that had nothing to do with them, when really a person sitting right behind her was unknown to her, but the words that she was saying were damaging this woman from Peru. And she texted me later to say, you know, I get this a lot, and we get this a lot. We, being people who speak Spanish or people who are from different countries, why are you here? Why don't you go home? Why are you different? And I think there's maybe an expectation that you would have that that happens in the world, but not in the church. And I think the experiences like that, of witnessing that, I saw so much fear. So much fear, so many questions that had to do with fear, so many concerns that had to do with fear. Fear of loss, fear of losing material possessions, fear of losing jobs, fear of increased crime, fear of the other. And I think there's a sadness in my heart for the church to operate so much from a place of fear. And I think there's just, so I have asked myself the question and asked the Lord the question, if your word says so frequently that your heart is for the vulnerable and for the brokenhearted and for the orphan and the widow and the sojourner, and your people have been held accountable to that, to the prophets, to you throughout the history of the Israelite nation, and where God was constantly saying, you're my people, remember, I brought you out of Egypt. I brought you out of slavery. I brought you out of pain. I gave you this promised land. I chose the vulnerable to care for. And then when Jesus announces his ministry in Matthew, when he talks about freeing the oppressed and giving sight to the blind and binding up the brokenhearted, there was that in the church, and then there was the opposite of that in the church. And I think we had volunteers. We worked with over 500 to 600 volunteers in the 4.5 years that we were there. And often we would have volunteers who, the deeper they became committed, the harder it was for them to relate to their small groups, to their Bible studies. When they would talk with me about the reception of when they started talking more about their interactions and their own discoveries with refugees and in serving refugees or becoming friends with people who had come as refugees. When they would go back to talk with their Bible study or at their church, it would get to the point where they were becoming ostracized by their Bible study.
I saw that so much. Yeah. I had so many really grieving people I spoke to, usually baby boomers or older, who their friends wouldn't talk to them or would shut them down. I even knew a couple people who were shouted at by people they had sat in Bible study with for 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
So that fracture is just real and really heartbreaking.
It's made me, in my own, I think, really asking, what is the remnant? And you recognize that throughout your journey with Christ. I don't always look like Christ. I don't always make Christ-like decisions. Do I want to be held accountable to representing Christ in every moment? No. I mean, I need grace and I need forgiveness. And so I struggle and I fight to think about things from that perspective. But when I look at the system, when I look at the overarching system of church, I find myself asking the question, is church really helping us discover Jesus' heart? Is the model of the mega church where there's so much money and the choices for where that money goes, or where the priority for resources goes. So often it is that spend is in order to perpetuate an institution.
I know for World Relief, I mean, why you guys closed, you had to raise all of your own funding because the president's policies had dramatically reduced funding, as well as actual numbers of refugees. And wasn't the number like you had to raise $180,000 to stay open for
300,000?
300,000. But you did raise a good portion of it, and then what was left to raise but didn't get raised by the church?
It was about half.
Yeah.
About half had been committed, and I think World Relief was in a position, because of the reduction of numbers, the federal funding was tied directly to refugee arrivals, the number of arrivals. And so when the arrival came, the funding came from the US State Department. So when, before the executive order in 2017, the cap had been 85,000, and then a special increase to 110,000. When that was banned, for the 3-month period, and then the reduction of numbers so significantly down to
the travel ban. For people who don't know who are watching this, so you had the travel ban in, what was it, February of 2017, but it was also attached to a 3-month moratorium on refugees entirely. And then that got sued in the courts a couple of times. So because it was seen as unconstitutional, because the first travel ban was entirely banning Muslim countries, as the president had promised. He said he wanted a Muslim ban. And so by the time the third one came out, and the only way to make it constitutional was to add non-Muslim majority countries, he signed that executive order and he said, well, you know what this is. We're not going to say what it is because we're not allowed to say that, but you know what this is. But I was so heartbroken because, one, I want Muslims here. It was weird being a girl who has shared Jesus with Muslims. That's very controversial. Not everyone agrees with that idea. But then to see the fear, and I'm like, Muslims are some of the closest friends I have, and the Muslims we were bringing from various countries through resettlement, they had seen absolute travesty through civil war, through ethnic specific violence in places like Myanmar toward the Rohingya, or the Syrian civil war, Iraq, where people who had fought alongside the US were being tortured by ISIS. And they were all getting banned from the country until Venezuela was banned, which was a terrible thing because, terrible things are happening there. And North Koreans, like, why would we ban North Koreans? They are leaving, if they get out, they're leaving one of the worst dictatorships in the world. But that's how we got it to pass legally. So just that background, because not everyone will understand that. So that ends up affecting the funding, because obviously no refugees, then no money.
Yeah, I think, our minds tend to move mostly to the negative, and I definitely wrestle with that when I look back on many experiences with the institution of the church, the hierarchy, the lack of access to having conversations. I think I have never in my career, having been really successful in banking and working for Barclays in London, and then running an organization, an international organization where we employed 100 survivors of human trafficking. That's a pretty female-dominated field. I hadn't ever felt my womanness as a barrier until working with the institution of the church. And that really shook me. And I think seeing the fear and the hate that I saw toward the other and the tribalism has definitely made me take a closer look at Jesus and ask the question of, if this is a majority of people who follow Jesus, well, that's not how I've ever experienced Jesus or seen him. or seen his example. So what is that? Where is that difference? And it's definitely led me to search and to ask questions. And God has met me in those because he's so gracious. And he does that for us. And he doesn't do that just for me. He does that for anyone who's seeking. And I think,
go ahead. Sorry.
I mean, I think my faith in some ways, my perception of church and perceptions of the model, specifically in the evangelical church, when you look at leadership being so predominantly white men, and you see scandal after scandal, or you see corruption, or you understand where the money is going, it's for me to like experience some of those things firsthand in a way that I hadn't before. Definitely has made me take a step back and say, where do we look like God, and where do we not, and who does and who doesn't. And I think I've never been so attracted to kindness as I am now, like small acts of kindness. And I think not the giant $8.5 million raised for a church to be built, but what does it look like to have a small act of kindness? And you see that in any church, evangelical, Catholic, etc. And where is someone willing to love the other, and where is someone willing to step out in faith? It's so layered. It's so layered, and it's not perfect. And but it's definitely made me take a look at like certain theological perspectives on God, on the word, on violence, on economics.
I know some of my saving grace really was I lived abroad for 11 years, and I have friends all over the world, having been a missionary in the UK with Crew or Agape over there, belonging to really healthy churches when I was in England, and then having lots of friends from other cultures, even within the UK. And when I first started encountering the fear that you saw, it was 5 years ago. I was newly back to Ohio, and I can't count the number of times I was screamed at an event, or watched, somebody say something absolutely caustic to me online as I was posting something about what's happening with refugees. And just the heartbreak. Like, I know one particularly we both were at was at my own church. I remember having a friend who had come as a refugee share her story. She was a Christian, and that lady standing up in the middle of a room of hundreds of women and starting to scream about how we shouldn't allow refugees to come here. They were bringing Sharia law. And it was like everything she was saying was a lie, first of all. Like, there's no Sharia law in America. And it was really anti-Muslim immigrant rhetoric. But the woman who had just shared doesn't even have a Muslim background. And so I felt this like grief on two ends of, we're treating a guest to our church so shamefully and so abusively. She had to be told to sit down, but then knowing nobody chastised her. There was no church discipline about her behavior. She was allowed to do that. And I've seen that at a lot of places where those who are most angry or who say that's a political thing, we don't want to talk about refugees, those voices won. And then the pastor wouldn't have the hard conversation with his church about the fruit of the Spirit or about how welcoming the stranger is biblical. And if you shout at them in the middle of an event, you're being sinful. Like, I was waiting and hoping for those conversations. Like, I have a really strong theology of church, and part of that means accountability. Part of that is, church discipline, that we would teach the full counsel of God. And watching the angry voices have so much power to either be able to silence pastors or to be able to silence, in our sense, like that woman tried silencing an immigrant refugee who had just shared her story. And I tried pursuing her. I tried getting in touch with the lady, to tell her, everything she believed wasn't true. It had come from, I found her stories. They had come from Breitbart, which is a far right fringe website that doesn't peddle in journalism. It peddles in fear and falsehood. But she just wouldn't engage. And I think for me, I just walk through pain and heartbreak and really like bewilderment at the fruit that was coming out of the church, thinking the church sent me overseas to introduce people to Jesus and sent me at points into places where what I did was illegal according to other countries' rules. Like I've been to countries where you're not allowed to talk about Jesus, and I've gone there with the blessing of Christians who paid for me to get there as a missionary. And then seeing even some of my own supporters be so fearful and angry about the very same people groups coming to the US. It was just really jarring. And it was like, what are you really supporting? Are you believing in like Jesus's love for all people? Or yeah, I do have some sort of nationalist agenda, you know, that you want them to hear Jesus out there, but not to be your neighbors. And are we okay with having people as neighbors who don't follow our faith? And like, to me, to be a Christian means yes, because people shouldn't be ever forced to convert or manipulated into following Jesus. But even just from an American standpoint, like, do I believe what's in the Bill of Rights? Like, do I believe that living in a pluralistic country with a freedom of conscience toward religion means all of us are free and not just some of us, which means I hope that I have Muslim and Hindu and Buddhist and atheist and agnostic neighbors who are allowed to believe those things by conscience, even if I am theologically conservative and would love everyone. You know, I always joke to all my non-Christian friends, like, I want you guys to all know Jesus. But like, do I live in that belief that our country, according to what we've written, should be a place that welcomes a pluralism of beliefs? And that's what makes all of us free. But I just saw that not being lived out in practice. But I think for me, the hope was really in having so many ties outside of the country, because I basically have had a steady stream the last 4 years of Christians, of pastors, of national leaders in other countries. I hear from the UK, from the Netherlands, from Christians who are of Iranian background, from Christians in Japan, and who are looking at America and they're like, what in the world is going on? And they're grieved, and they write to me their fears of our theology, and their concern of theological drift, as they see this kind of fear of the foreigner and latching onto more closed door policies from so many people. But then I also had the contrast of, you know, we saw 160 people get involved with crossings, and about half of them served with World Relief. And so like, I saw the sacrificial Christians, and then I saw the really fearful people who didn't seem to exude the love of Jesus. And it's hard, it's holding both.
I think a grace that I felt in the time of World Relief was that we would never have stayed open through all that happened in the time that we opened. Just to think of 75 years of history of refugee resettlement agencies to start an office to resettle refugees in 2015 through 2019. Probably couldn't have had more pressure on the resettlement program than during these last several years, last 3 to 4 years.
Let's turn that then to transition to maybe our last 2 questions. I know we could talk for like probably 2 hours on this. Does everyone want to watch us? So it was a lot of pressure on your office because of the kind of climate the last 5 years have been. Wednesday was October 1st, and that's when the refugee resettlement number gets announced every year. Or sorry, it was the last day of September, the 30th. And so it has to be announced by October 1st. And so it was a last minute, 30 minutes before the deadline. The president always issues the number of resettled refugees. And he, for the 3rd year in a row, bottomed it out at a new record low of refugees. So the number last year that was declared was 18,000. And then we've only resettled just over 10,000 in the last 12 months. And his new number is 15,000. And so every year he's only resettled about half of what his declared lowest number is. And he's cut them in half every time. what do you think? Like, how do you respond to, we are at a point in history where we have the most refugees ever globally. There's lots of crises where we should be responding to welcome. And the wealthiest country in the world set the refugee ceiling at 15,000. What's your response to that? Somebody who's lived through those cycles of cut.
I see it as a tragedy, not just for refugees, for the few refugees who ever get resettled to another country, is less than half of 1% of the 79 million refugees in the world. And the history of refugees in America, the safety, the fact that all of the statistics and facts show that they drive down crime. And when refugees and immigrants move into neighborhoods, both petty crime and violent crime are reduced.
I just had a the police chief of Dayton, Ohio, shared that at an event last week, and that was true for his city.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's evident. I think the fear is misplaced, and you can. It's a fascinating thing to me that it's not really about facts, because if we were really looking for the facts, then we would want refugees in our communities. What they're able to bring economically, and I think where the people who have leaned so heavily against refugees also often claim that economics are their, one of the top two deciding factors for who they vote for what they promote politically, etc. And so it's misaligned, and I think the fear is misplaced, and I think that fear and also the prejudice that comes with that decision, I think it will have long-term effects. I mean, I think when we look at America and we think about the gap in jobs, the gap in STEM jobs that are predicted, shortages in healthcare staff, for example, where so many immigrants fill those roles, it makes me question economically how it will impact us, these decisions about refugees and asylees and immigrants in general. And I think, and then I think for the people who have chosen to support it, may not feel that impact personally. But I think the loss culturally, for America and what we say we stand for in general, there's a tragic misalignment there, and it will lead to people dying. And I think I can say it in a way that feels somewhat detached, but I think I trust that God moves outside of America, and I think if we don't praise him, then the rocks will praise him. And so if America doesn't, as a community, as a nation, does not step toward that, God will raise up someone else who will. And I think that's our loss.
Yeah. I agree. Thanks for reflecting on that. I was speaking to a friend's son yesterday on just like Messenger and checking in on him. He's undocumented in Turkey, and his mom came through resettlement. He was in prison for his faith at the time. And I was just checking in, and he was like, I'm never going to see my mom again, am I? And it just broke me. Like, here's a young guy who spent his early 20s in jail for his Christian faith. And the refugee resettlement program declining has kept him from his mother, but also the travel ban that was started in 2017. His home country is still part of that ban, and it's ongoing. And, I think one of my prayers is that truth would be told, that truth would prevail over this. So things like the travel ban, it was based on lies. This is because of 9/11 was quoted. We're going to prevent America from another terrorist attack like 9/11. And none of the countries in 9/11 were included in the travel ban, which the US conveniently has a lot of economic deals with. But we ended up banning mostly Muslim majority countries that either have lots of religious persecution, people leaving, or they're leaving totalitarian states, or there's civil war or other conflicts happening where Muslims, Christians, other ethnic minority groups are needing to leave, and we closed our doors. So my prayer is that we would believe in truth. I don't think we're there yet, though. I still think Christians are susceptible to believing lobbyists and kind of fringy sources for news that aren't necessarily true. I see a lot of people that get their news from social media rather than from legitimate journalism. But it still doesn't stop me. Like I'm continually praying that people would have their eyes open to what's true and then act accordingly based on what's true and not on what's false. But it feels like a long road ahead of us.
Yeah.
All right. I will finish us up. I mean, this has probably been a solid hour. Kara, it's been so fun talking to you. It just feels like we're ignoring everyone else and just having our own friend conversation as we match. It's a tough week as we look at those numbers, but we've kind of lived through that. And you talked about your grief with World Relief closing in Akron. Is there anything that gives you hope for the future? Like what gives you hope that this will all change or that something better will come? What's that look like?
I think the hope in remembering the welcome that I received so often in my travels, and wishing that welcome for refugees. So when that may not be happening by the American church, I do believe that God moves in his church, and his church isn't all in America. And so to have a former caseworker who's living in Turkey, for example, working with people who have come as refugees across the border, to know that those things are moving out. One of the former volunteer coordinators from World Relief now lives in Geneva, Switzerland, and is serving refugees through the organization that she works for there. That is the Lord's church, and the way that God will serve those refugees. I am grateful for that. I think the character of Jesus gives me hope. I think the way that Jesus treats women, the way that Jesus includes the other, the way that Jesus moves toward the other, his example will never shift in that. And so while we may or may not follow that example is steadfast. God's promises, God is love, and his creation and his imago Dei in each person across the world, he's calling out his glory. And I think there's a question of, how do I follow that? How do I look for that? How do I be that? And so, I have a hope in the remnant, and the way of Christ is through suffering, and suffering brings empathy, and suffering brings compassion, if we allow it. And so for the people who have suffered greatly, God is often among them. And there's nothing new under the sun. So empires will fall, and God's word stays steadfast.
Yeah.
And so I have hope in that. I want to say, like, even where I'm working now, I'm the only white person working on the team that I'm working on. And I've just led 30 different focus groups and talked with over a couple hundred people about racism. And to have those conversations are so similar to conversations that I've had with refugees, and the resilience that people have is incredible and hopeful and inspiring. And on my hardest days, they probably look very little like the hardest days that refugees and immigrants have endured. And so I go back to that. What does it look like to pray every day for 8 years? And how does God bless others through that faithfulness that we may never know?
Can we mirror that
Mm-hmm.
pattern of trusting in the Lord by praying that faithfully? I don't. I give up. I get mad. Yeah, I think that's a good word, Kara.
Yeah, and I think to watch people in the church love so well. There are examples of volunteers who just loved so well. And I think of a good friend who is one of the first Good Neighbor teams for probably one of our very toughest families, just with a lot of trauma. They moved to Minnesota about a year ago to be with some of their family. And this volunteer family who loved on them here in Akron just traveled out to see them. And the love that the kids have for the other kids in the family, that love comes from somewhere. And to have observed that and seen the commitment and the passion and the fight of so many, and I almost want to say especially of white women in the church, was the hardest demographic to engage. And I experienced the most fear and the most meanness in that demographic. But I also experienced the deepest love and deepest commitment to vulnerable families within the same, of people who look the same. And so there's a grace in that and a hope in that, that you can never put someone in a category forever.
That's beautiful. Kara, I'm going to end us on that note. And I hope everyone's watched to the end. If they don't, that's okay. Thank you so much for speaking.
Thank you, Christy, for your continued advocacy.
My pleasure. Thanks, my friend.